If you've been following the SoCHiology podcast since I launched it in 2021, you will be aware of the reverse psychology sub-series, which is basically unpopular Chicago opinions from Chicago. You will also be aware of the SAT, the SoCHiology awareness test, where I quiz random Chicagoans about different questions in regards to Chicago history and culture. Well, this Black History Month, I'm introducing the ChicaGOATS sub-series. This is basically a Black Chicago history blitz that details and gives brief summaries of different Black Chicagoans that lived in our city and did great things in their respective careers and left a huge impact not on the city but on the entire world. So without further ado, let's get into it. From Harold Washington to Harold's Chicken and everything in between and beyond, this is SoCHiology. Let me get a 6-wing fried hard salt and pepper mild sauce. That's the order every time I go into Harold's Chicken. That's what I say. And depending on who you talk to, their order is going to be very similar. I remember early on going to the Harold's Chicken on 127th and Halsey. It's still there. And it's actually still to this day one of my favorite locations. You see, you can't talk about Chicago without talking about food. You can't talk about Chicago without talking about chicken. And there are plenty of restaurateurs that I could talk about on this ChicaGOATS series, but on this episode, I chose to discuss the Chicken King, Harold Pierce. Born on August 11, 1917 in Midway, Alabama, Harold Pierce moved to Chicago in 1943, where he started to work as a chauffeur. By 1950, him and his wife was running a small restaurant on 39th Street, the H&H, and is specialized in chicken feet and dumplings. Now, his friend, Gene Rosen, told him he can expand on his recipe, and he gave him some chickens that he owned from his poultry shop, Gene Rosen, that is. And Harold began to experiment with this chicken as well as developing a new sauce called mild sauce. And this prompted Harold Pierce to open up his first Harold's Chicken Shack at 47th and Greenwood in 1950. He eventually franchised the idea out to friends and family, and they opened up their own Harold's Chicken Shacks throughout the city. And the only stipulation was that Harold required them to purchase their chickens from Gene Rosen. But otherwise, he didn't interfere with the management or the stores. But this led to deviations in the techniques, the flavors, and the qualities of the product. And some would say that was a bad thing because we all know today in 2024, all Harolds are not created the same. They're all not equal. But nonetheless, Harold Pierce experienced a lot of success from Harold's Chicken Shack and the expansion that he engineered with his brand. He eventually retired in the early 1980s, and unfortunately in Kankakee, Illinois, he died from prostate cancer in 1988. That's when he became an ancestor. But the Harold's Chicken Shack brand continued to grow rapidly. I mean, now it's nationwide. You know, there's one in Atlanta, there's one in Los Angeles, they're in Las Vegas. One recently opened up in Minnesota, I believe. They're in Dallas. You know, Harold's Chicken Shack is nationwide. It's not just all over the Southside of Chicago and the suburbs. And the mild sauce revolutionized how you eat chicken. You know, it's not barbecue sauce, it's not hot sauce, it's mild sauce. And like I said, because he didn't interfere with the techniques and the operations of his franchises, the deviations expanded as well. So depending on what Harold's you go to, the taste ain't gonna be the same. And it's not just Harold's. There are other restaurants that have their own versions of mild sauce now as well. But nonetheless, the Chicken King, Harold Pierce, he had a culinary genius in the 1940s and the 1950s, and it expanded and is still feeding people, it's still blessing people to this day. And like I said, you cannot talk about Chicago without talking about food. You can't talk about Chicago without talking about chicken, and you certainly can't talk about Black Chicago without talking about mild sauce. And mild sauce originated with the Chicken King, Harold Pierce of Harold's Chicken Shack. If you enjoyed this podcast, I ask for 2 things and I will love you forever. Number 1, please engage with us on social media. So like, share, subscribe, and comment on whatever platform you're listening to it on. And number 2, please make sure you pass on to a friend who will enjoy it as well.